She thought she could humiliate his babysitter from childhood and be left with no repercussions. But the millionaire did something no one expected. Subscribe and tell us where you're watching us from. The iron gates of the Devereaux estate stood tall, a symbol of power and legacy that had endured for generations. As the sleek black car rolled up the long gravel driveway, Nicholas Devereaux leaned back in his seat, exhaling slowly. The sight of his childhood home stirred something deep within him, a mix of nostalgia, reverence, and an undeniable weight of responsibility. It had been years since he had last set foot here, years spent building his empire, making a name for himself far beyond the boundaries of his family's vast estate. And now he was returning, not just as a man of success, but as a husband. Beside him, Isabel sat poised, her manicured fingers idly tracing the leather interior of the car. She exuded elegance, a woman of refined tastes and high expectations. She had been thrilled by the idea of marrying into one of the wealthiest families in the country. But the moment the estate came into view, her lips pursed slightly. It was grand, certainly, but to her, it felt outdated. She had envisioned something more modern, something that matched the opulence of the life she had envisioned for herself. Nicholas noticed the subtle shift in her expression but said nothing. He had long learned to let her opinions remain unchallenged when it came to matters of aesthetics. Isabel was a woman who knew exactly what she wanted, and more often than not, she got it. As the car came to a slow halt before the grand entrance, the estate staff had already assembled in perfect formation, waiting to receive their returning master. He recognized a few familiar faces among them, old, loyal servants who had been part of the household since his childhood. But his eyes searched for one person in particular. Before he could step out of the car, the grand oak doors swung open and two figures emerged. His aunt, Marian Devereaux, stood tall and regal, her sharp eyes scanning him from head to toe. She had always been the backbone of the family, the one who ensured that the Devereaux name remained untarnished. Beside her was his older brother, James, whose smirk was both welcoming and teasing. Nicholas stepped out first, smoothing his jacket, before turning to offer his hand to Isabel. She accepted it gracefully, stepping out with the practiced ease of someone who had attended 1,000 galas and high society events. The moment her heels clicked against the stone pavement, her gaze swept across the gathered servants, lingering on them with an expression of detached curiosity. Marian was the first to speak. "Nicholas, it's good to have you back." Her voice carried warmth, but it was tempered with the cool authority she never seemed to shed. She glanced briefly at Isabel before nodding in acknowledgement. "And this must be your wife." Nicholas smiled. "Aunt Marian, James, this is Isabel." Isabel extended her hand, her lips forming the perfect socialite smile. "A pleasure to meet you both. Nicholas has spoken of you often." Marian shook her hand with the slightest tilt of her head, a silent assessment in her eyes. James, on the other hand, took her hand lightly and smirked. "Welcome to the Devereaux estate, Isabel. I hope you like it here." She smiled, though there was something unreadable in her gaze. "It's certainly impressive." Nicholas glanced past them, his eyes still searching. Finally, he spotted her. Standing just a few steps behind the other staff, slightly apart from them, was Mabel. The years had touched her, but she remained as he remembered, dignified, strong, her dark skin lined with the passage of time, but her presence unchanged. She stood with the quiet grace that had always defined her, dressed in her simple yet impeccable uniform. Her hands were clasped before her, but there was warmth in her eyes. He took a step forward. Mabel. The way her face lit up, the way the corner of her mouth lifted in a knowing, affectionate smile, it made something tighten in his chest. "My boy," she said, her voice steady but full of feeling. "You're home." Without hesitation, Nicholas closed the distance between them and wrapped his arms around her. She smelled of lavender and familiarity, of comfort and childhood memories. She patted his back lightly, the same way she had when he was a boy seeking comfort after a scraped knee or a bad dream. Isabel watched the exchange with something close to surprise. She had never seen Nicholas embrace anyone so openly, not even his own family members. He was a man of measured gestures, calculated interactions. But here, with this old servant, he seemed entirely unguarded. When they finally pulled apart, Mabel took a small step back, studying him. "You've grown into a fine man." Nicholas chuckled. "I hope so. Though I imagine you'd still scold me if I deserved it." "I would," she admitted with a twinkle in her eye. Marion watched the exchange with quiet approval, but James's gaze flickered toward Isabel. He saw the barely concealed confusion in her face, the way her lips pressed together just a little too tightly. He smirked slightly, as if already sensing trouble brewing. Nicholas turned back to Isabel, his hand lightly resting on the small of her back. "Mabel, this is my wife, Isabel." Mabel nodded politely. "Welcome, ma'am." Isabel hesitated for the briefest of moments before offering a small practiced smile. "Thank you. It's lovely to meet you." The handshake that followed was brief, but something about it made Mabel's expression shift ever so slightly. Isabel's grip was cool and fleeting, her gaze detached. And then, just as quickly as the moment had come, it passed. James leaned in slightly toward Nicholas, just enough for only him to hear. "Well, that was an interesting introduction." Nicholas gave him a sharp look, but James only grinned knowingly. As they moved into the house, Isabel let her gaze wander across the interior. The estate was undeniably grand, but there was an old-world charm to it that didn't align with her vision of luxury. The high ceilings, the dark wooden furniture, the elaborate tapestries, it felt more like a museum than a home. Nicholas, however, felt something entirely different. This was where he had grown up, where he had been raised. Every room held a memory, every hallway a whisper of his past. And at the center of so many of those memories stood Mabel. As the doors closed behind them, Isabel let out a slow breath, her gaze flickering toward Nicholas before settling briefly on Mabel. She didn't say a word, but in that moment, something unspoken passed through her eyes. It was the beginning of something neither Nicholas nor Mabel could yet see. But James saw it. Marion saw it, and soon Nicholas would too. The great hall of the Devereaux estate was alive with the quiet hum of activity as the evening drew near. The golden glow of chandeliers cast a warm light over the polished wooden floors, reflecting off the ornate frames of centuries-old portraits that lined the walls. Dinner was being prepared, the scent of roasted meat and fresh herbs drifting from the kitchen, mingling with the crisp evening air that seeped through the slightly open windows. It was the kind of setting that had always felt familiar to Nicholas, a place of tradition and family. But tonight, for the first time, there was a subtle undercurrent of tension, a thread so fine it was almost imperceptible. Nicholas sat in the drawing room, his gaze shifting from the flickering fire to Isabel, who stood by the grand piano, trailing her fingers idly across its polished surface. She had been quiet since their arrival, but not in a way that suggested contemplation. Rather, it was the kind of silence that spoke of judgment, of measured observations forming conclusions she had yet to voice. "You've barely said a word since we got here." Nicholas finally said, watching her carefully. Isabel turned slightly, her expression unreadable. "Just taking it all in," she replied. "Your home is traditional." The pause before her last word was slight but noticeable. Nicholas exhaled through his nose, a small knowing smile playing at his lips. "That's a polite way of saying outdated, isn't it?" She didn't deny it. Instead, she let her gaze wander once more before turning toward him. "It has history, I'll give it that, and a certain charm." Nicholas studied her, recognizing the careful diplomacy in her words. He knew Isabel well enough to understand that she was holding back the full extent of her thoughts. Perhaps it was because she knew how much this place meant to him. Or perhaps she was waiting for the right moment to voice her opinions in a way that would seem less like criticism and more like a gentle push toward change. A soft knock on the door interrupted their conversation. A moment later, Mabel stepped inside, her presence as steady and composed as ever. She was dressed simply, as she always had been, her uniform neat, her posture effortlessly graceful. There was no mistaking the warmth in her gaze as she looked at Nicholas, but there was also something else, a quiet observation of Isabel, a moment of silent assessment. "Dinner is ready," Mabel announced, her voice carrying the same calm certainty it always had. Nicholas nodded, standing. "Thank you, Mabel." Isabel remained still for a beat longer before offering a small smile. "That was fast. Your staff is efficient." Mabel inclined her head slightly. "We do our best, ma'am." Nicholas didn't miss the slight hesitation before Isabel followed him out of the room. It was subtle, the kind of thing most people wouldn't notice. But Nicholas had spent a lifetime reading people, understanding the nuances in their expressions, the weight behind their words. And what he saw in that brief moment was not warmth, nor even polite indifference. It was something cooler, something distant. The dining room was set beautifully, as it always was for family meals. The long mahogany table gleamed under the candlelight, the silverware meticulously arranged, the plates adorned with dishes that had been prepared to perfection. The family had already begun to take their seats by the time Nicholas and Isabel arrived. Marian sat at her usual place at the head of the table, her eyes flickering with quiet scrutiny as she observed Isabel. James lounged a few seats down, his smirk ever present, as though he found the entire evening amusing in some private way. Nicholas pulled out Isabel's chair for her before taking his own seat. Mabel, as she had done for years, ensured that everything was in place before finally settling into the chair that had always been hers. Isabel noticed. For a moment, she said nothing, her expression carefully neutral as she picked up her glass of wine. But when she spoke, her voice was light, almost playful, though the words themselves carried a sharper edge. "I wasn't expecting the staff to dine with the family." The table fell into a brief, heavy silence. Nicholas's hand tightened slightly around his fork. Marian's gaze sharpened. James, ever the spectator, leaned back in his chair with the faintest hint of amusement. Mabel, however, did not react outwardly. She simply looked at Isabel with the same steady patience that had carried her through years of tending to this household. "I've been with the Devereaux family for a long time, ma'am. This has always been the way of things." Isabel tilted her head slightly. "Interesting," she murmured, taking a sip of her wine. "I suppose every family has its own customs." Nicholas exhaled slowly, setting down his glass. "Mabel is more than just staff, Isabel. She practically raised me." "Of course," Isabel said smoothly. "That's why it's different. I'm just not used to it." Mabel inclined her head slightly, as if accepting the explanation. though Nicholas could tell she understood the undertone as well as he did. The conversation shifted after that, moving toward safer topics. Marion asked Nicholas about his work. James made a few teasing remarks about his younger brother's return to the family fold. But every now and then, Nicholas caught Isabel's eyes flickering toward Mabel, studying her in that same cool, assessing way. By the time dinner ended, the air between them had settled into something quieter, but no less significant. Nicholas didn't know what it was exactly, but he could feel it. A subtle shift, a tension that had not been there before. As the plates were cleared and the family dispersed for the evening, Nicholas lingered in the dining room for a moment, watching as Mabel collected the last of the glasses. She paused when she saw him, her expression as calm as ever, but he could see something beneath it. "She's adjusting," Nicholas said, though the words felt weaker than he wanted them to. Mabel simply nodded. New places, new people, it takes time. But Nicholas had the distinct feeling that time wouldn't change whatever had just begun. When he found Isabel in their room later that night, she was standing by the window, looking out at the vast expanse of the estate. He stepped behind her, resting a hand lightly on her waist. "You were quiet at dinner," he said. She glanced over her shoulder at him, her lips curving into a soft smile. "Just taking it all in," she repeated. Nicholas let the silence stretch between them for a moment before nodding. Neither of them said anything more, but the unspoken words lingered between them, a silent weight settling in the air. Something had shifted tonight, and though Nicholas couldn't quite name it, he knew it was only the beginning. The following morning, sunlight spilled through the high windows of the Devereaux estate, casting long golden beams across the polished floors. The house was already stirring with quiet activity. Servants moved about their duties, the faint clinking of silverware echoed from the breakfast room, and the scent of freshly brewed coffee drifted through to the halls. Nicholas woke early, stretching as he adjusted to the familiar yet distant comfort of his childhood home. He glanced toward Isabel's side of the bed. She was still asleep, her golden hair spread across the pillow, her breathing slow and steady. He dressed quickly, deciding to take a walk through the estate before breakfast. The air outside was crisp, carrying the fresh scent of morning dew mixed with the faint aroma of flowers from the garden. The estate was vast, with acres of land stretching beyond the horizon. The same land where he had once run as a boy, chasing the summer breeze with laughter in his throat. He had spent countless mornings like this with Mabel, walking by her side as she told him stories, her voice weaving magic into the air. As he wandered toward the gardens, he heard the quiet murmur of voices near the sitting room. He stepped closer and paused just outside the doorway. Inside, Isabel stood near a side table, inspecting one of the framed photographs. Mabel was beside her, adjusting the curtains, moving with the same unhurried grace she always carried. The atmosphere was not tense, but there was something carefully restrained in the air, a quiet undercurrent that Nicholas could feel even from the hallway. "This house has so much history," Isabel said, tilting her head as she studied the photograph in her hand. It was an old picture, Nicholas as a boy, no more than 7 or 8, sitting in the grand library with a book far too big for his small hands. Beside him sat Mabel, her warm eyes watching over him as he concentrated. It was a memory Nicholas had always cherished, one of the countless moments when Mabel had been more of a mother to him than his own had ever been. "Yes, ma'am," Mabel replied with quiet dignity. "It's been a home to many generations." Isabel's lips curved slightly, but the smile didn't quite reach her eyes. "I suppose certain things remain unchanged," she mused, setting the frame back on the table. "Though I imagine some things could use Updating. There was a pause, just long enough to be noticeable. Mabel said nothing, only continuing with her task, her face unreadable. Like these old portraits, for example, Isabel continued, turning her gaze toward the walls. They give the house such a museum-like feel. Wouldn't you agree? Mabel glanced toward the paintings, her expression remaining neutral. They are a part of the family's history, ma'am. Isabel let out a soft hum of amusement, as if she found the sentiment quaint. She turned away then, brushing her fingers over the furniture as she moved. I'll have to talk to Nicholas about it, she said, almost as an afterthought. A home should reflect its owners, after all. Nicholas chose that moment to step inside, making his presence known. Isabel turned at the sound of his footsteps and greeted him with a slow smile. "Good morning," she said. "I was just admiring some of the pieces around the house. This estate really does hold on to the past, doesn't it?" Nicholas glanced at the photograph she had been holding and then at Mabel, who met his eyes briefly before returning to her work. He understood what was happening, even if Isabel spoke with a light tone. "Some things are worth holding on to," he replied simply. Isabel's smile didn't falter, but there was a flicker of something in her gaze. "Of course," she said smoothly. "I was just saying how certain traditions can be charming, but others, well, they can make a house feel stuck in time." Nicholas said nothing, only watching her. After a beat, she stepped closer and placed a light kiss on his cheek. "I'll see you at breakfast," she murmured before leaving the room. The silence stretched for a moment after she was gone. Nicholas turned to Mabel, searching her face for any sign of discomfort, but she was as composed as ever. "She'll get used to things," he said, though even to himself the words felt like an excuse. Mabel gave him a small, knowing smile. "Change can take time," she replied simply, before moving on to her next task. By the time breakfast was served, the family had gathered in the dining room once again. The morning light filtered through the tall windows, illuminating the pristine table settings and the careful arrangements of fresh fruit, pastries, and steaming cups of coffee. Marian sat with her usual poised elegance, sipping her tea as she observed everyone with her quiet, assessing gaze. James, ever relaxed, leaned back in his chair, stirring sugar into his coffee with an air of detached amusement. Isabel was in a particularly good mood, speaking animatedly about their plans for the day, suggesting a possible renovation of certain rooms. "Nothing too drastic, of course," she assured the table, her tone perfectly pleasant. "Just a few modern touches to bring everything up to date." Marian raised an eyebrow but said nothing, while James merely smirked over the rim of his coffee cup. Mabel, as always, moved about the room with quiet efficiency, ensuring everything was in place. Then it happened. A sudden movement, a slight flick of the wrist, and a glass of red wine toppled over, the deep crimson liquid spilling across the pristine tablecloth. The stream of wine didn't just stain the fabric, it splashed directly onto Mabel's uniform. A small, sharp intake of breath followed, but Mabel did not flinch. She only took a slight step back, glancing down at the spreading stain before carefully reaching for a napkin. "Oh dear," Isabel said, her voice light with mock concern. "How clumsy of me." The words were spoken with such ease, such effortless insincerity that the air in the room seemed to still for just a moment. Nicholas stared at the scene before him, something cold settling in his chest. James's smirk faded slightly, his gaze flickering toward his brother, waiting to see what he would do. Marian set her teacup down with deliberate precision, her eyes sharpening. Mabel dabbed at the stain with a napkin, her movements slow and methodical. "It's all right, ma'am," she said evenly. "Accidents happen." Isabel tilted her head slightly, watching Mabel with that same unreadable expression. "Yes," she said, "they do." Nicholas felt a strange, tightening sensation in his throat. He should have said something. He should have told Isabel to be careful, to apologize properly, to acknowledge that this was more than just an accident. But the words didn't come. Instead, he remained silent, watching as Mabel excused herself from the room with quiet dignity. As the door closed behind her, the weight of the moment settled fully onto Nicholas's shoulders. The discomfort he had been pushing aside for days was no longer ignorable. Marion glanced at him, her expression cool. "You really should be careful with your wine, Isabel," she said, her voice carrying an unmistakable edge. Isabel only smiled, lifting her glass once more. "I'll try to be more mindful next time," she said smoothly. James let out a quiet breath, shaking his head as he leaned back in his chair. Nicholas sat in silence, his fingers curled tightly around the stem of his glass, the words forming on his tongue but never leaving his mouth. And in that silence, something shifted. The afternoon passed in a strange, heavy quiet. The tension from breakfast had settled like an invisible weight over the estate, thickening the air with something unspoken yet undeniable. Nicholas had tried to distract himself with work, retreating to his father's old study, a room lined with floor-to-ceiling bookshelves and the scent of aged leather and polished wood. But no matter how much he tried to focus, his thoughts kept returning to the scene at the dining table. The dark stain on Mabel's uniform, the forced politeness in Isabel's voice, his own silence. He had told himself that Isabel hadn't meant anything by it, that the spilled wine had truly been an accident. But the way she had smiled afterward, the way she had looked at Mabel, there had been something deliberate in it, something calculated. And Mabel's reaction had been just as telling. She had not been flustered. She had not protested. She had simply cleaned the stain and walked away, as if she had already known that nothing else could be done. Nicholas exhaled slowly, rubbing his temples. He needed to talk to Mabel, to check on her, to make sure she was all right. But before he could rise from his desk, a soft knock echoed against the wooden doors. "Come in," he called. The door creaked open, and Marion stepped inside, her expression unreadable as she closed the door behind her. She walked over to the small bar cart in the corner of the room, pouring herself a small glass of sherry before turning to face him. "You've been hiding in here all day," she said, her voice calm but pointed. Nicholas sighed. "Just trying to get some work done." Marion took a slow sip, then set her glass down with precision. "Or trying to avoid facing what's happening under your own roof." Nicholas's jaw tightened. He had been expecting this conversation, though he had been hoping to put it off a little longer. "What do you want me to say, Aunt Marion?" he asked, leaning back in his chair. Marion studied him for a moment, then walked closer, taking the seat across from him. "I want you to say something, Nicholas. Anything. I want you to acknowledge that what happened at breakfast was not an accident. That Isabel's behavior toward Mabel has been nothing short of disgraceful." Nicholas didn't respond immediately. He drummed his fingers against the desk, his mind turning over the right words, the right response. But Marion was watching him too closely, and he knew she could see the conflict in his eyes. "Isabel doesn't understand how things work here," he finally said. "She wasn't raised in a house like this, with a staff that's treated like family. She's still adjusting." Marion exhaled sharply, shaking her head. "That's a weak excuse, Nicholas. Adjusting is one thing. Humiliating an old woman who has dedicated her life to this family is another." Nicholas felt the sting of her words, but held her gaze. "What do you want me to do? Confront my wife over a spilled drink?" Marion's expression hardened. "I want you to open your eyes before it's too late." She stood then, smoothing out the creases in her dress. "Mabel won't complain. She never has. But that doesn't mean she isn't hurt. And if you continue to stay silent, Nicholas, you'll regret it." She left without another word, leaving him alone with the silence and the weight of everything he had refused to acknowledge. That evening, dinner was a much quieter affair. The family gathered in the dining room as usual, but the air felt strained, as if everyone was waiting for something to happen. Nicholas sat at the head of the table, his mind distracted, his appetite absent. Isabel, on the other hand, was as poised as ever, effortlessly carrying the conversation, seemingly unaffected by the morning's events. Mabel moved around the room, serving as she always did, her face a mask of quiet professionalism, but there was a tiredness in her eyes that Nicholas had never noticed before. And then, just as dinner was winding down, Isabel struck again. As Mabel reached across the table to refill Isabel's glass, Isabel let out a soft, exaggerated gasp and jerked her arm, causing the glass to tip over. The dark liquid spilled once more, this time across Mabel's hand and the front of her uniform. There was a sharp intake of breath from the other end of the table. The silence that followed was deafening. "Oh dear," Isabel murmured, placing a hand over her chest in mock concern. "I really must be more careful." Mabel froze for only a fraction of a second before she straightened, dabbing at the stain with her napkin. "It's all right, ma'am," she said softly, her voice steady. But it wasn't all right. It wasn't all right at all. Nicholas felt something hot rise in his chest, an anger that he had never quite felt before. He opened his mouth, ready to say something, to stop this before it went any further. But then he hesitated, and in that hesitation, the moment passed. Mabel excused herself from the room, moving with quiet dignity as she left. The door shut behind her, and the silence that remained was suffocating. Marion set down her fork with a sharp clatter, her eyes flashing with barely contained fury. "That is enough." Isabel blinked at her, feigning innocence. "I beg your pardon?" "You heard me," Marion said coldly. "I don't know what kind of behavior is acceptable in your world, Isabel, but in this house we do not treat the people who raised us like trash." Isabel's lips parted slightly, as if she was surprised by the sheer force of Marion's words. But then she let out a soft, breathy laugh and shook her head. "Oh, come now," she said lightly. "It was an accident. There's no need to overreact." James, who had been silent until now, finally spoke, his voice laced with quiet disdain. "You've got quite the talent for accidents, don't you?" Isabel turned toward him, her expression briefly flickering with something colder, sharper, but it disappeared just as quickly. She looked back at Nicholas then, her eyes searching his, as if daring him to take a side. For a long moment, he said nothing. Then, finally, he exhaled and reached for his wine glass. "Let's not turn this into something it's not," he said, his voice measured, neutral. Marion's expression darkened. James shook his head, and Isabel, satisfied, smiled. Nicholas took a slow sip of his wine, but it tasted bitter on his tongue, because deep down he knew it already was something. And he had just let it happen. The house had never felt so heavy. The halls, once filled with warmth and familiarity, now carried an air of unease, a quiet tension that seemed to settle in the very walls. Nicholas had spent the better part of the day trying to shake it, burying himself in paperwork, going for a ride around the estate, doing anything but facing the gnawing feeling in his chest. But no matter what he did, the memory of the previous night lingered. The way the wine had soaked into Mabel's uniform, the way she had excused herself without complaint, the way Isabel had smiled. And, worse than all of it, the way he had said nothing. When he passed through the main hall in the afternoon, he found James leaning against the grand staircase, arms crossed, watching him with a knowing expression. "You look troubled, little brother," James mused, pushing off the railing. "Could it be because you're finally realizing that your wife is a nightmare?" Nicholas shot him a glare. "Not now, James." "Oh, but when exactly?" James followed him as he walked toward the study. "Because if you wait too long, you won't just lose your dignity. You'll lose Mabel, too." Nicholas stopped mid-step. James's words hit him harder than he expected, but he forced himself to keep moving. He didn't need this conversation, not now. James let out a sigh, watching him with something close to pity. "You always were the one who cared too much about keeping the peace," he said. "But tell me, Nicholas, does it really feel peaceful to you right now?" Nicholas said nothing as he entered the study and shut the door behind him. The evening arrived too soon, and with it, another dinner. Nicholas could feel the weight of everyone's eyes on him the moment he stepped into the dining room. Marian's sharp gaze, James's silent amusement, Isabel's poised indifference. And then there was Mabel. She moved through the room with the same quiet dignity as always, her face betraying nothing. But Nicholas knew better. He knew the signs of exhaustion, a quiet resignation. She had been enduring, as she always had, but for how much longer? Isabel had barely touched her plate before she set down her fork and turned toward Nicholas with a sweet smile. "I was thinking," she began, her voice light. "It's time we made some changes around here." Nicholas took a slow sip of his wine. "What kind of changes?" "Well," Isabel gestured vaguely toward the room, "it's no secret that the house is, how shall I put it, stuck in another era. There's a lot we could do to modernize it." Marian's expression didn't shift, but there was a tension in her shoulders. James raised an eyebrow, clearly entertained. Nicholas placed his glass down. "It's an old house, Isabel. It has history." "Yes, of course," she said smoothly, "and I respect that. But there are still some things that could be updated. For example, the staff's quarters. It seems a bit strange, doesn't it, that they're still so close to the main wing?" A silence fell over the room. Mabel's hand paused briefly as she set down a fresh serving tray. James let out a low chuckle, shaking his head. "Oh, this is getting good." Nicholas exhaled slowly. "What exactly are you suggesting?" "I'm just saying," Isabel said, toying with the stem of her glass. "Perhaps it's time we reconsidered certain arrangements. The house is meant to be a home, not a museum, and honestly, I just don't see why some traditions need to stay in place." Marian set down her fork with a quiet clink. "Isabel," she said, her voice cool, "I don't believe you understand the nature of this household." "Oh, I understand perfectly," Isabel said sweetly. "I just think it's outdated." Mabel remained silent, standing just at the edge of the room, but Nicholas could feel the weight of her presence. The air was thick, suffocating. Isabel was making it clear she wanted Mabel gone. Nicholas felt his throat tighten. "Mabel has been here longer than anyone," he said finally. "She's family." Isabel tilted her head, her expression unreadable. "She's staff, Nicholas." The finality of her words sent an uneasy ripple through the room. Mabel did not flinch, did not react, but Nicholas knew her well enough to see the faintest shift in her posture. the way her fingers curled just slightly at her sides. Marion was watching Nicholas now, waiting. James was leaning back in his chair, clearly enjoying the spectacle. And Nicholas said nothing. Not because he didn't have the words, but because in that moment he realized something terrifying. If he spoke, if he fought for Mabel, it would mean war. And for the first time in his life, he wasn't sure if he had the strength to fight it. The meal carried on, but the damage had already been done. Later that night, when the house had settled into quiet, Nicholas found himself wandering the halls, his feet carrying him without thought. He didn't realize where he was going until he stopped in front of Mabel's quarters. The door was slightly ajar, the dim light of a lamp casting a soft glow against the wooden floor. He knocked lightly. A pause, and then Mabel's voice. "Come in." He stepped inside. The room was small but comfortable, filled with little pieces of her life. A stack of neatly folded blankets, a framed photograph of him as a boy sitting beside her on the front steps. The air smelled of lavender and something warm, something familiar. Mabel was seated in a chair by the window, looking out at the darkened estate. She turned to him with that same quiet gaze, the one that had always held more understanding than words ever could. Nicholas hesitated. "Are you all right?" Mabel smiled, but there was something tired in it. "I've been through worse, my boy." He ran a hand through his hair, exhaling. "I don't know what to do." Mabel watched him for a long moment before speaking. "You already know," she said softly. "You're just afraid of doing it." He swallowed, feeling that same weight in his chest, the one that had been growing heavier with each passing day. Mabel reached out then, placing a gentle hand over his. "You were always a good boy," she murmured. "I know you still are." Nicholas closed his eyes for a brief second, the warmth of her touch grounding him. But when he opened them, he knew. He knew what was coming, and he knew that if he didn't make a choice soon, he would lose something far more important than his pride. The days that followed passed in a strange, heavy fog. Nicholas felt himself moving through them as if he were watching from a distance, detached and uncertain, his mind replaying every moment, every unspoken word, every silence he had allowed to stretch too long. The estate remained as grand as ever, its halls filled with the familiar sounds of life. Footsteps echoing against polished floors, the distant hum of conversation, the clatter of silverware against porcelain. But beneath it all, there was something else. A tension, an unease that had begun to take root so deeply that even the staff moved differently, more carefully, as if trying not to be noticed. Nicholas had spent most of his time avoiding the heart of the house, retreating to his study, taking longer than necessary in the stables, walking the far edges of the estate in quiet contemplation. Anything to avoid looking directly at the truth that had begun to settle over him like a thick, suffocating blanket. But the truth did not wait. It did not allow itself to be ignored. And it came crashing down upon him one evening, in the worst way possible. The Devereaux family was hosting a formal gathering that night, an event meant to introduce Isabel properly to the extended family and close family friends. It was a tradition, one that Nicholas had grown up with, though he had never given it much thought. But now, standing in the grand ballroom as guests arrived in shimmering gowns and tailored suits, he felt nothing but exhaustion. The weight in his chest had not lifted, no matter how many times he had told himself that he needed to push forward, that things would settle in time. Isabel, of course, was in her element. She moved through the crowd with effortless grace, exchanging pleasantries, offering polished smiles, laughing lightly at the right moments. To anyone watching, she was the perfect hostess, the poised and elegant new mistress of the Devereaux estate. Nicholas watched her from a distance, a glass of whiskey in hand, and wondered how he had failed to see it before. The way she could transform, how easily she could slip into whatever role was required of her. He had once admired that about her, had found it impressive. Now it unsettled him. The evening carried on, filled with conversation and laughter, but Nicholas remained distant. He spoke when spoken to, nodded when appropriate, but his mind was elsewhere. It was only when he caught sight of Mabel across the room that the numbness in his chest cracked, just slightly. She was not dressed for the event, of course, nor was she part of the celebration. She moved through the space quietly, as she always did, ensuring that everything was in place, that the guests were comfortable, that the evening went smoothly. And yet, even in her silence, she commanded a presence that Nicholas could not ignore. He was about to move toward her when he saw it happen. Isabel was standing with a group of guests, including a few of Nicholas's longtime acquaintances, and for the first time that evening, her expression held something less than warmth. He didn't hear the first words exchanged, but he saw the way her lips curled slightly, how the guests around her reacted, some shifting uncomfortably, others smiling in that way people do when they sense drama unfolding before them. And then the laughter. It was soft, restrained, but unmistakable. Nicholas's stomach turned as he made his way closer, his ears catching the last part of Isabel's sentence. Really, I don't understand how certain things haven't changed here. Holding on to the past is one thing, but at some point, one has to recognize when something is no longer necessary. The woman beside her, Marissa, one of the longtime family acquaintances, shifted slightly. You mean the house itself? Oh, not just the house, Isabel said smoothly. I mean certain traditions, certain people. Marissa's smile faded slightly, and Nicholas felt the slow, sickening realization of where this was going. Someone else in the group, Gabriel, another familiar face, let out a chuckle. Ah, I see. You mean the, old maid? Isabel didn't confirm or deny it. She simply took a sip of her wine and let the silence speak for itself. And that was when Nicholas saw Mabel. She had paused just a few feet away holding a tray, her back perfectly straight. For a moment, she did nothing. She did not react. She did not flinch. But Nicholas saw the way her fingers tightened just slightly around the tray, the briefest flicker of something in her expression before it was gone again. A slow, simmering rage began to rise in Nicholas's chest. Before he could think, before he could rationalize, he was already moving. "Excuse me," he said, his voice sharp, cutting through the conversation like a knife. The small group turned toward him, and Isabel's expression barely flickered. If anything, there was the faintest trace of satisfaction in her eyes. "Nicholas," she greeted smoothly, as if nothing had happened. "We were just talking about enough." The word left his lips before he had even realized he had spoken it. The conversation around them stilled. Nicholas turned his gaze to the others, his tone controlled but firm. "This is not the kind of discussion that will ever take place in my home again." Gabriel looked mildly uncomfortable. Marissa took a slow step back. Isabel, however, simply tilted her head slightly. "Darling, I was only making an observation. I said enough." This time the words were sharper, colder, and for the first time that evening, something in Isabel's expression flickered. Nicholas turned then, his eyes locking onto Mabel's. "I apologize," he said quietly, so only she could hear. Mabel studied him for a long moment, then nodded once. I should return to my duties, sir." He wanted to stop her, wanted to say something else, but she had already turned away. Nicholas remained standing there, the weight of what had just happened settling over him like a suffocating blanket. Isabel was watching him now, her gaze sharp, assessing. That was quite the reaction, she mused. Nicholas exhaled slowly, turning to face her fully. "You humiliated her. I did no such thing. You knew exactly what you were doing." Isabel's lips curled slightly. "And you knew exactly what you were marrying." The words were soft, but they hit him with more force than he had expected. For the first time, he truly saw her. Not the woman he had once admired, not the carefully polished socialite, but the person beneath it all. And what he saw made something deep inside him crack. He had made a mistake. And now he had to decide what he was going to do about it. The night dragged on, filled with the murmur of conversations and the occasional clink of glasses, but Nicholas felt as though everything around him had blurred. The realization sat in his chest like a stone, pressing down, making it difficult to breathe. The way Isabel had looked at him, the way she had smiled when she delivered those words, "You knew exactly what you were marrying," had stripped away whatever remained of his illusions. He had spent too long pretending, too long convincing himself that her sharp remarks were simply a misunderstanding, that her indifference toward Mabel was a product of unfamiliarity. But it wasn't. Isabel knew exactly what she was doing, and worse, she enjoyed it. Nicholas left the ballroom without another word. He heard the laughter behind him, the music playing as the party carried on, but it no longer mattered. He needed air. He needed space. The halls of the estate were quiet as he walked, his footsteps echoing against the marble floor. The weight of his silence from the past weeks pressed against his ribs, each unspoken word suffocating him. He had failed Mabel. He had allowed this to happen. And now, as much as he wished he could turn back time, he knew there was only one thing left to do. He stopped outside the sitting room where he had last seen her. Pushing the door open, he found the space empty, the fire burning low in the hearth. A tray sat on the side table, the tea long gone cold. Nicholas let out a slow breath, rubbing a hand over his face. He was too late. A voice behind him made him turn. "You finally figured it out." James stood in the doorway, arms crossed, watching him with something that resembled both amusement and disappointment. Nicholas exhaled sharply, shaking his head. "Not now, James." James stepped into the room, leaning casually against the back of one of the armchairs. "Oh, I think now is the perfect time," he said. "You're finally seeing her for who she really is, aren't you?" Nicholas didn't answer. James let out a short laugh, shaking his head. "God, Nicholas, I knew you were blind, but this? You let her treat Mabel like a piece of dirt, and you just stood there." "I know," Nicholas muttered. "Do you?" James raised an eyebrow. "Because from where I'm standing, it looks like you're just now realizing what the rest of us saw from the beginning." Nicholas turned away, staring at the flickering flames in the fireplace. "I made a mistake." "No," James corrected. "You made several mistakes." He sighed, his tone losing its edge. "But at least you finally see it. The question is, what are you going to do about it?" Nicholas clenched his fists. "I'm going to fix it." James studied him for a long moment before nodding. "Then do it quickly, because if you don't, she'll be gone before you get the chance." The words sent a chill through him. Nicholas left the sitting room and made his way toward Mabel's quarters. His heart pounded against his ribs as he walked, his pulse quickening with each step. The thought of losing her, of allowing her to walk away from the home she had dedicated her life to, was unbearable. He reached her door and hesitated for only a moment before knocking. Silence. He knocked again, more urgently this time. Finally, the door opened. Mabel stood before him, already dressed in a traveling coat, a small suitcase beside her. Her expression was calm, but there was something final in the way she looked at him. Nicholas felt his throat tighten. "You're leaving." Mabel nodded slowly. "Yes." He stared at her, words failing him. He had expected this, he had known it was coming, but seeing it was something else entirely. "You don't have to go," he said finally, his voice quiet. Mabel smiled, but it was a sad smile, one that carried years of understanding. "My dear boy," she murmured, "I stayed as long as I was needed, but it seems I'm no longer welcome." Nicholas took a step closer, his chest tightening. "That's not true. You are welcome. This is your home." Mabel looked at him, her gaze steady, unwavering. "Is it?" The question hit him harder than he expected. She took a breath, her voice gentle but firm. "A home is a place where you are respected, where you are valued. I spent my life here, Nicholas. I raised you. I loved you as if you were my own, and yet I have been humiliated under this roof, treated as if I am nothing." Nicholas swallowed hard. Mabel continued, "And the worst part? It wasn't just Isabel, Nicholas. It was you. Your silence hurt more than anything she could have said." The truth of her words burned. He had no defense, no excuses. "I was a coward," he admitted quietly. Mabel studied him for a long moment before nodding. "Yes," she said simply. Nicholas exhaled sharply, running a hand through his hair. "I don't want you to leave, Mabel." She reached out then, gently placing a hand on his cheek, just as she had done when he was a child. "Then prove it," she said softly. "Make this right, not just with words, but with actions." He nodded, his jaw tight. "I will." Mabel lowered her hand and stepped back, picking up her suitcase. "Then I will wait to see if you do." With that, she turned and walked past him, moving through the hall with quiet dignity, leaving him standing in the doorway with the weight of his failures pressing down on him. Nicholas didn't move for a long time. Then, slowly, he turned on his heel and walked back toward the main house. The time for silence was over. When he entered the bedroom, Isabel was sitting at her vanity, removing her earrings with careful precision. She met his gaze through the mirror, her lips curving slightly. "Ah," she murmured, "I was wondering when you'd finally come to your senses." Nicholas stepped forward, his hands clenched at his sides. "Pack your things." Isabel blinked, her expression flickering with brief surprise before settling into something colder. "Excuse me?" "I said, pack your things," Nicholas repeated, his voice steady, final. "You're leaving." A short, breathless laugh escaped her lips. "You're serious?" "Yes." Isabel turned fully now, slowly rising to her feet. "And where exactly do you expect me to go?" Nicholas exhaled, his patience frayed. "I don't care, but you will not stay under this roof." She studied him for a moment, her eyes narrowing. "All of this," she said slowly, "over a maid?" Nicholas's jaw clenched. "Over Mabel," he corrected. "Over you. Over everything you've done. Everything I allowed you to do." Isabel's expression darkened. "You'll regret this, Nicholas." "No," he said, shaking his head. "For the first time, I won't." He turned away, leaving her standing there, her breath sharp, her fury palpable. As he walked out of the room, out of the house, into the cold night air, Nicholas felt something lift from his shoulders. For the first time in weeks, he felt like himself again. But there was still one more thing to do. He had to make things right. The morning light cast a soft golden glow over the Devereaux estate, but the house itself felt different. The air was lighter. The oppressive weight that had settled over the halls for weeks now lifted. Yet Nicholas knew that this was only the beginning. Isabel was gone. The news had traveled quickly, though no one openly spoke of it. The staff, who had once moved cautiously in her presence, now walked with a quiet sense of relief. Marian, though she said little, had given Nicholas a long, approving nod that morning over breakfast. James had smirked, raising his coffee cup in a silent toast, before muttering something about finally growing a spine. But Nicholas wasn't concerned with any of that. There was only one thing that mattered now. He stood outside, the cool breeze ruffling his shirt as he watched the narrow road leading away from the estate. Mabel had left the night before, her silhouette disappearing into the darkened landscape. He had let her go then, knowing that she needed space, knowing that she had been hurt too deeply to simply be convinced with words. But now he was going to bring her home. He didn't take the car. He didn't want the barrier, the cold separation of glass and steel. Instead, he walked. The road was familiar, lined with towering oaks whose branches swayed gently in the morning air. He remembered walking this path as a child, Mabel's hand wrapped around his, her voice filling the quiet with soft stories and gentle lessons. When he reached the small cottage on the outskirts of the town, his heart clenched. It was modest, tucked away behind an overgrown garden, but it was well kept. Mabel had always been proud of her space, of her independence. He hesitated for only a moment before knocking. The door opened slowly. Mabel stood there, dressed in a simple blouse and a long skirt, her silver-streaked hair tied back neatly. She looked at him with an unreadable expression, waiting. Nicholas exhaled. "May I come in?" Mabel studied him for a long moment before stepping aside. The inside of the cottage was warm, familiar. The scent of lavender lingered in the air, mixed with the faint aroma of freshly brewed tea. Nicholas glanced around, taking in the small details, the carefully folded blankets, the framed photos of the estate, of him as a boy. His throat tightened. Mabel moved toward the kitchen, pouring tea into 2 cups before setting them on the wooden table. She took a seat and gestured for him to do the same. He sat, his hands clasped together. The silence stretched, but it wasn't uncomfortable. It was waiting. "I let you down," Nicholas said finally, his voice low but steady. "For weeks, I let you be treated like you were nothing, and I did nothing to stop it. I saw it happening, I knew it was wrong, and I still didn't speak up." Mabel's eyes didn't waver. "I let her make you feel like you didn't belong in that house," he continued. "But you do. You always have. And I hate that it took me this long to say it." Mabel was quiet for a long moment. Then she sighed, setting her cup down with a careful precision. "You were always a good boy, Nicholas," she said softly. "But sometimes even good boys lose their way." Nicholas swallowed hard. Mabel studied him as if searching for something deeper. "Tell me, why did you stay silent?" The question cut through him more than he expected. He exhaled slowly. "Because I didn't want to lose her." Mabel nodded as if she had already known the answer. "And now?" Nicholas met her gaze. "Now I know that losing you would have been far worse." Something in Mabel's expression softened, but she said nothing. Nicholas leaned forward. "I don't expect you to forgive me right away. I don't expect you to come back just because I ask, but I need you to know that I'm not the same man I was 3 days ago, or a week ago, or a month ago, and I will spend however long it takes proving that to you." Mabel watched him carefully, and for the first time, he saw something break in her. Not entirely, not fully, but just enough. She let out a small, weary sigh. "I should have left a long time ago," she admitted, "but I didn't, because despite everything, this is my home." Nicholas's chest tightened. "Then come home." Mabel hesitated. She reached for her cup, fingers wrapping around the porcelain, but she didn't drink. "You don't need me there anymore," she said after a moment. "You're a grown man, Nicholas." He shook his head. "That's not true. You were never just someone who looked after me. You're my family, Mabel, and family belongs together." Mabel's fingers tightened slightly around her cup. Nicholas took a slow breath. "And if you still want to leave, if you decide you don't want to come back, I'll understand. But I needed to tell you this. I needed you to hear it." The silence stretched between them again, heavy but not suffocating. Then, slowly, Mabel sighed. She set her cup down, meeting his gaze with something warmer than before. "Finish your tea," she murmured. "Then we'll see." Relief flooded through Nicholas, but he didn't rush to celebrate. He simply nodded, lifting his cup, savoring the warmth, the familiarity, the quiet understanding that filled the room. When they left the cottage together later that morning, the road back to the estate didn't seem quite as long. The house was waiting, and this time it would feel whole again. If you enjoyed this story, make sure to subscribe for more. Don't forget to share this video with your friends and let us know your thoughts in the comments. Check out our other videos for more compelling stories. See you in the next one.